Some of them seek the fountain of youth. That's an old tradition in Florida.
To the sunshine of Florida comes a distinguished vacationer, Winston Churchill.
The president-elect finishes his impromptu talk when...
Would you look at that? You stuck around for episode 2 of Why Are We Like This, the podcast where the entire state of Florida is just one big active crime scene, a microdose of the American experience. And I'm joined by my host, co-host, Gerald. Gerald, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
And Tomas.
Hey. How are y'all?
This week, we're going to take a trip into Florida's storied and chaotic past, exploring our origin myths in search of something that can serve as a little bit of a coda to help understand exactly why the state is like this and why we're like this and why we're subject to those conditions. To help us out, lend some historical perspective, we decided the smartest thing to do when we're just getting our shit together and trying to figure out how we want our podcast to be is to just invite on a really high-profile podcaster, somebody who we don't really know that well and fuck up a lot in front of him. So we are joined by Matt Christman of Chapo Trap House. Matt, how are you?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Thanks for joining us. Matt, what is your outsider perspective just broadly of Florida as a state and as a punchline, I guess?
Well, I've only been there a few times. Been to Orlando a couple times to go to Disney World with the fam. Been to Tampa when I was in college for a couple days. But that's basically it. And that's I'm comfortable with that. That's about as much Florida as I think I need. I'm going to be going there again in October. We're doing a show in Fort Lauderdale. So that'll be my first time seeing the tip of Florida, just the tip. So
for all the folks who are listening and want to show up at Matt and Chapo Trap House's show, that's going to be on October 30th at Revolution in Fort Lauderdale, which is a very fun venue, as far as Fort Lauderdale goes, at least.
Yeah, I'm going to go see you guys in that show. Is that the first time you guys are doing the show in Florida?
Oh, yeah, and probably the last. So, it might not be there just long enough for us to have another one.
Yeah. Get your pictures now. The pictures will last longer than the fucking state itself.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. Today, anybody who's been to St. Augustine knows that it's a tacky, overrated tourist destination. It spends half the year flooded, the entire year smelling like piss. It's the ideal vacation spot for Americans who appreciate early Spanish colonial architecture, but who don't want to profane their ears by actually having to hear people speak Spanish. So 509 years ago, though, it was something entirely different. When Juan Ponce de Leon came ashore on April 2nd in 1513 in search of the mythical Fountain of Youth, which I don't think he ever found, the humid tropical coastline was all marshland, completely different than it is now. 8 years later, he returned with the intention of colonizing the territory and caught a poisoned arrow in the leg for his trouble. And that Spanish sortie beat a hasty retreat to Cuba where he died. And this would begin sort of what would be a long-standing tradition of us perpetrating violence against our tourists, which we still do for fun and for profit. But today, Ponce de Leon is buried at the Catedral Metropolitana Basilica in Puerto Rico, which is right next to a really cool bookstore, if any of you ever find yourselves over there in Old San Juan. But it's not settled that Ponce de Leon was even the first European to spot Florida. The Cantino Planisphere is the earliest surviving map illustrating Portuguese geographic discoveries. It contains a peninsular-shaped landmass located northwest of Cuba, commonly thought to be sort of an early portrayal of Florida. And that predated Ponce de Leon's trip by about 10 years. But either way, Ponce de Leon and his possible Portuguese predecessors were far from the first to populate the Sunshine State, because when in 1492, there was an estimated 350,000 native peoples that were already there and had been there for thousands of years. Matt, do you have any familiarity with the Cantino Planisphere? Have you ever studied that particular cartography that I guess was like early Portuguese understanding of the shape of the globe?
No. What did Florida look like in it? Was it kind of chody, skinny? What was the deal?
Exactly. Yeah, I can actually show you. It was very chody, like that.
Oh.
Over here, okay. This area is supposed to be Florida because this is Cuba.
Right.
So I guess and then there are some schools of thought that say that this was just like an early understanding of the Yucatan Peninsula, which it also kind of looks like a little bit. But giving the Portuguese the benefit of the doubt, you can call it Florida, I suppose. Pre-colonial Florida was split among those indigenous people. It was not the Seminole, like many people think, but actually the Pensacola, Appalachee, Guale, Timucua, Potano, just a bunch of different tribes. And north of Daytona Beach, north of Orlando, they were people that relied a lot on cultivating maize and corn, as you would call it, Tomas. And then down here in the South, though, it was much more sort of less agriculture and far more like estuarian and sort of like living off of the land as opposed to actually cultivating any of the land. And one thing I thought was interesting in reading up for this was how they adapted to storms and hurricanes, which obviously occurred back then. They just didn't have buildings, and they would rebuild much more easily, obviously, than we can these days. And I just kind of found that to be interesting in that maybe that's something that we can learn from as we continually get our houses knocked over year after year as new record storms come through. So that kind of brings us up to one thing I wanted to talk about with you, Matt, was like that I'm woefully lacking in knowledge of is the time that Andrew Jackson spent down here, and the first Seminole War and kind of how that played out in Florida, and how it sort of set this like bloody tone for even through today and even through like the 20th century. What transpired there. And I didn't go to school down here, and if I did, I probably still wouldn't have learned it. But like what happened during the Seminole War and Andrew Jackson's campaign as sort of like Florida's first military governor? Is that something that you have a lot of familiarity with?
I mean, a bit. It's interesting because it is the most expensive, the most brutal, and the most high casualty Indian War that America fought. And it's the one that they kind of didn't technically win because some of the Seminoles who resisted the Americans were never formally surrendered because it was such a inhospitable territory. It really was America's first Vietnam in a sense. And it was part of the broader effort to pry Florida away from Spain and then to occupy it with American forces. Andrew Jackson, when he was there, he found a couple of British subjects who were there ostensibly trading with the Spanish colonial authorities, and he unilaterally hanged them, which caused a huge diplomatic row and became Jackson's first real controversy. And he spent the rest of his career with a remaining grievance in his pocket about anybody who condemned him for what he did. It was part of his general and deep hatred of British people that extended from receiving a cutlass blow from a British officer during the Revolutionary War when he was a teenager.
And he would go on to not be very controversial as a
not at all
or anything like that. No. Later on, Florida obviously became the 27th state on March 3rd, 1845, and almost half of the population at that time were enslaved people, many of whom had fled other southern states in search of freedom. And following the Third Seminole War, the Seminole attack on Fort Myers, after which the majority of Seminoles were brutally forced to Indian territory. And at this time, Florida had one of the highest per capita murder rates, which sounds familiar for a lot of us who still live here, due largely to the lack of central governance, which kind of also sounds familiar for those of us that still live here. And it was still, I suppose, like kind of a backwater and pretty lightly populated by the context of that day, right? I mean, Florida was not in the Revolutionary War, pre-revolution, or sorry, in the Civil War, pre-Civil War era. It wasn't like a key player nationally, was it?
Yeah, no, Florida didn't really have much to do during the Civil War. There were some Florida units in the Confederate Army, and it's always funny when you're reading about a battle and then you read about the 10th Florida showing up or something, and you just imagine a bunch of guys in Bermuda shorts, or like parrot heads with muskets.
Just a lot of Jimmy Buffett fans just popping into
Tommy
Bahama.
Bahama.
Which I mean, when you say that, actually, like I was reading about how the majority of the shores were blockaded during the Civil War, and I just imagine like a Trump flotilla of people that just can't get out of out of the Gulf of Mexico, or can't help but keep capsizing everywhere because of their like kind of riding through each other's wakes and capsizing their $500,000 yachts.
Man, I'm just imagining the Monitor just chugging around through a beautiful boater flotilla and just wiping them out.
They should have insurance for that.
Matt, was there any effort, or is there any record of like secessionists or Southern forces trying to replicate the guerrilla tactics that the Seminoles employed in Florida or in any of these like inhospitable terrains?
I mean, not really, because there were no real Union forces for them to really even fight down there. It's an interesting question, because there of course was guerrilla tactics employed by irregular Confederate sympathizing units, but largely in Appalachia. So it's interesting to imagine what they would do down in the swamp. But yeah, Florida was mostly just hanging out, getting blockaded, and then surrendering.
So after the war, during Reconstruction, Florida was readmitted, or just prior to Reconstruction, Florida was readmitted to the Union in 1868, and people still didn't really care that much about the state. It was still sort of backwater status, and that inattention allowed Democrats to sort of retake power in the state legislature pretty quickly, I think, relative to other Southern states, and that would begin what would become a long-standing practice of sort of rigging elections, subjugation of Black residents, and subjugation of Native residents too. By the start of the 20th century, Florida's population was a little more than 500,000, and that presaged what was going to be this really big population boom within the next 20 years, thanks mostly to industrialist Henry Flagler, who all of us down here know about, and the Florida East Coast Railway, which had connected the state all the way down to Key West by 1912. It's hard to imagine what this state must have been like before interstates, what it must have been like before roads. And, it's everything down here. It's so obvious if you spend any time in Miami that like, this is not a place where people are supposed to live. Like human beings aren't supposed to be here. And it's just that would begin, I think, like the first real incursion of man into this area where like, no, there's not supposed to be, beyond just the lightly sparsely populated areas where tribes live, not really supposed to be people here.
Yeah, it's a real affront to God. I mean, and that really is the story of American Manifest Destiny,
which is actually
generally.
our city motto. Our city motto in Miami is affront to God.
Because it's like, it's not just Florida where humans really shouldn't be living. The big westward push that is so romanticized as America's frontier heritage was largely a heedless gamble, and in most cases land swindle, to get people to settle and farm in places that did not have anywhere near the precipitation to facilitate the sort of intense cultivation that happened east of the Mississippi. And nobody found that out until they already got there, and at that point it's too late. And they essentially forced a social structure onto this inhospitable territory. I mean, I believe the winter of 1888, there was a storm in the Dakotas that killed hundreds of people, just cut through their homes. It didn't matter if they had a fire or anything. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. But they were mostly square-headed Scandinavian immigrants, so it didn't really matter. But then, of course, once America, is settled into a continental power, then after World War II and the invention of the air conditioning, they start moving into the Sun Belt, another place that's just even less, a place that's less hospitable than the plains have been, and just forcing, using technological capacity, privatized, of course, instead of used for some public good, to just turn these places into a spider web network of infrastructurally connected by roads and airports, affront to God. It's an affront to God belt, basically, that runs diagonally from the penis tip of Florida into the Mojave Desert and the Great Plains.
Yeah, there's a story about Henry Flagler. I'm sure you've heard it, but the way that he was convinced into building, like the railroad and expanding into Florida was because somebody brought him an orange from Florida in the dead of winter, and he was like, "We can make some money there. There's a lot of crops that we can build there," and it just kind of like, I think it's comparable to people like I don't know, it's like Elon Musk, right? Who has been talking for years about building, a tunnel system of, for his stupid like car thing in Miami through the limestone. Just these billionaires
Brilliant
who
idea.
are completely divorced from like the reality of just like the environmental and societal context of where they want to enact these like madmen projects, and they will just use their immense wealth to just make it happen at all costs, independent of just like who is already there, the environmental impact, the societal impact. I don't know. I just see like the echo of history repeating itself with these like insane people who just push their vision upon the rest of us.
Yeah, it's a nation of and for con artists, because it is just a giant speculative land scam. That's all America has ever really been. I mean, from the beginning, George Washington was first, before he was anything else, he was a surveyor and land speculator. That was his entire raison d'etre, and it went from there. And that means, at the end of the day, trying to get somebody to pay more for some parcel of land than there is any value to be found on it.
Yeah, Matt, I've heard you actually describe this before in really resonant terms, where you described that whole era as this political project where whenever pressure would build up, you just open up more land and give people more land to go after and to chase after.
Yes. And for a long time, it was the sole real source of revenue for the United States government was land sales. Because there was that Jeffersonian and then later Jacksonian hostility to tariffs and taxes that left there really nothing to do but for the government to collect obviously a ridiculously low price for the land that they held, which was then sold and resold by speculators who, of course, took that yeoman fantasy of equal, a barony of barons, everyone with their own little fiefdom, and pretty quickly turned it into a reproduction of like capitalists' domination over the resources, in this case, the land of the new territory.
Yeah, and we still see a lot of that. I mean, like, that's in a way kind of still happening here, Tomas, because like every couple of years, what are they trying to do? Move the development boundary deeper into the Everglades, try to find more swamp to drain, more land to create. And oh, well, if this house on this side of 137th Avenue is all of a sudden worth $1 million, why don't we build a whole neighborhood of those $1 million houses on this other side? Yeah, sure, maybe there's an entire swamp of crocodiles there right now, or alligators there right now, but we can fix that. We've fixed that in the past. So at this point, we see a pretty big influx of like what would become known as the Florida cracker movement coming down. People who don't mind mosquitoes and don't mind chopping their way through pretty shitty scrub land, blazing the trail to make this ambitious urban development that would slowly, over the course of the next 100 years, become places like Miami, places like Orlando, Tampa, other, pretty heavily populated urban core areas that define Miami now. But again, they ran into the same problem that they had always run into, which was those pesky Black, brown, and Native people that happened to be here first, that were here before them, that were here building things before they even arrived. Today, we're kind of like ground zero for some of the more arcane and sinister voter suppression efforts that happen. But that tradition has really deep roots down here. It's not new. It didn't come here with Ron DeSantis or Rick Scott. You can look back in November 2nd, Election Day of 1920 in Central Florida. It was marred by a brutal spate of violence that left at least 50 Black residents dead. They were murdered by whites who were furious over the recent passage of their voting rights. Today, we call it the Ocoee Massacre. purged the city, which today borders Orlando, to the west. It had no black residents for 60 years following that massacre, and sadly, that particular act of terrorism has yet to be portrayed on the silver screen by Damon Lindelof in Watchmen. So nobody knows about that one. That's the one that maybe he's saving for season 2 of Watchmen if it doesn't get canceled. But you also won't learn about it in our public schools either, because we don't teach that down here. Matt, are you aware of much of that? Or like there was also the Florida terror, the bombing campaigns that were happening sort of contemporaneously during all that period?
I mean, not specifically. That's definitely something that is not terribly well known anywhere. And yeah, like Florida has it's the civil rights movement and the suppression of black people in Florida is buried along with all of Florida's non-touristic history, really. It is amazing how, because it is considered sort of this pleasure dome for America's middle class, that more even than most places in America, it has no history that we can draw on, because nobody was there until the retirees showed up. Like nobody was really there. Nobody who counted. Nobody who could be considered part of a broader American project.
Yeah, and nobody wants it to, to your point, nobody wants that kind of history to yuck their yum. They want to just pretend that this was like a magical tropical land that was just founded, like 1980 or something like that. But prior to that, there was the murder of the activist Harry T. Moore. I don't know if any of you have read that story, but he was the first NAACP official assassinated in the civil rights era. And the Ku Klux Klan, which by then had laid down pretty solid roots in Florida at this in this time, bombed his house, killed him and his wife in an area that was not very far, just a couple of miles away from where Trayvon Martin would be killed 70 years later, 60 years later. So it's like a deep, bloody, but consistent history.
Amendment 4 passed in 2018, right? Restored voting rights to 1.5 million, people with prior felony convictions. The legislature decided to fuck with it. They passed an implementation bill that basically, messed up the whole process, established a fines and fees that needed to be paid for people to get their voting rights back. And what DeSantis has done now, I don't know if you've been following this, they've basically arrested people that committed election fraud.
I saw that. That was wild.
Yeah, but the thing is that the local supervisors of elections told these people that they could vote because the implementation bill that was passed was so fucked up, and the state bureaucracy has no real way of sifting through the records of who has paid their fines and fees. Because remember, a lot of these convictions are from decades ago. These are paper records. They're not in the digital system. The digital systems haven't been inputted correctly. So there was no way of tracking who has actually, gone through the process yet and who has paid all their fines and fees, if any. So again, the SOEs told these people that they could vote, and then they went out. They thought they could vote, a lot of them, 18, I think, out of 20. And then the state decided to, play politics with them and go arrest them on charges of election frauds, which a lot of cases can be felonies. So it's just disgusting. And again, I just think it just echoes into everything that David was talking about. This history of just brutalizing, working class populations, but largely black populations, and just using them again to just play these horrible political games with them.
Well, that's the same way that they catch anybody for crimes, right? It's all entrapment.
Yeah.
Entrapping people is how you get convictions. These assholes don't know how to solve crimes, so it makes sense that they would use the same tactics here to enforce this deeply intimidating campaign that has the explicit purpose of keeping people who are not comfortable with the law for very good reasons that have nothing to do with their criminal record from voting. That's what's so, I guess, inevitable and horrifying about DeSantis is that he is the inevitable result of Trumpism, because Trump is this breach with politics that comes sort of as a black swan, because you can't political system can't account for a figure as singular as Trump to take it over. It's just it's inconceivable. You can't plan for a thing like that because it would make it impossible for you to function day to day. But it created this new reality, and because he is singular, there is nobody to fill the breach but regular politicians, and they saw that if they were going to harness the lightning there, that Trump was unleashing with the base and with a declassified and a reclassified and sort of racially polarized, maybe not for Black people so much, but definitely for Latinos, that's incredibly valuable for them. And how are you going to make it into something that can transcend one man? And DeSantis's play is take everything that is just an ambient grievance that goes into the sort of chant of complaint that Trump represents. Like, hey guys, here's your chance to vote for someone who will simply embody your own grievance.
Yeah.
And really, that's all they need. But that's because he's Trump. If you want to be a non-charismatic, fucking Shar-Pei-looking dork with a squeaky voice like Ron DeSantis, and you want to get that lightning, you have to have results. So you take those grievances and actually do something about them. Yeah. And because Florida is the rotten floorboard in America, of course, he's able to just, with after getting basically no mandate in a 50-50 race, just take over the entire apparatus of governance and direct it towards building a policy around MAGA. But, that isn't the whole of the appeal. And there is a real question in the national level, not maybe in Florida, because you guys might be fucked. I'm sorry. Whether that is acceptable and digestible outside of that context, because, DeSantis ain't Trump in every way.
Yeah, a lot of his political project is like coming up and say, "Hey guys, remember how we hate, that there's a black Little Mermaid now? Well,
yeah, exactly.
I'm gonna fuck over Disney. How does that make you feel?
Right. Trump doesn't have to actually do anything. He can just be like, "They've got there's a black Little Mermaid, folks. What's going on?" That's all they need.
When I was a
kid, to love him and vote for Republicans.
Well, you remember in the 90s, she was a white girl. She was nice. You remember?
She's beautiful. She had red hair.
And then when she got the legs, remember when she would get the legs?
She had wonderful legs. They're saying some of the best legs we've ever seen.
Legs for days.
But Matt, I actually want to chew a little bit on what you said, because you talked about intimidation. So going back to the, this stuff that happened with the former felons, right? They held that press conference where you are going to go do a show in Broward County, and they did that on purpose because that is the most democratic, bluest county in the state, right? So it's entrapment, but rarely do you see like a governor make such a circus and a spectacle of the entrapment in such an obvious way. But they in Florida, you all have talked about the Proud Boys a lot in your show, right? And I think there's like a tendency to dismiss them as like, people that are just like idiots or whatever. But in Florida, they've really become an instrument of the state. And I swear I'm not being hyperbolic. They have become the little like black shirts or brown shirts of the DeSantis administration. And I'll give you an example. So last week, the Miami-Dade County School Board took a vote on whether to redesignate actually October as LGBTQ History Month, something that was already been approved, by the way. So there's already a precedent and it's been established.
Did it last year?
Yeah. Only the sponsor of the item voted for it, even though most of the school board has always voted on this. And it was because, and it's funny you mentioned Latinos, the school board was flooded. Hundreds of people, hundreds of mostly Latinos, which as a Latino was embarrassing and shameful for me, of just the most homophobic, most vitriolic stuff about groomers and pedophiles and turning our kids trans and trans ideology just for hours, for like 12 hours at the school board. There were like literally like masses of Proud Boys outside of the school board, just, intimidating people, yelling at them.
To even walk into that public meeting, you have to go through a phalanx of Proud Boys, of what is it, Fred Perry polo wearing assholes,
and they succeeded,
and sizing you up to see if you have any of those cultural indicators that you're a Target shopper instead of a Walmart shopper, and if you're too Target, then you're going to be called out, you're going to be harassed, and it's insane. But it's absolutely 100% allowed and endorsed.
But there's a synergy there because they succeeded in there's no LGBTQ History Month now, and
they won.
I think that matters, I think that matters in our school system, and it happens on a lot of issues whether you're seeing these people intimidate very aggressively to avoid to keep the public away from these issues, to prevent people from showing up, to prevent people from speaking out, and to stop elected officials from taking courageous stances because they're afraid. They're afraid of the governor removing them from office, and they're afraid of these people targeting them, doxing them, showing up at their houses. So, Florida is getting rough, man.
I mean, the way I see it, there is this floridification of America occurring. Florida is like the most extreme example of it. And yes, it's the place where Trumpism is turned into an actual logic of governance and not just a spectacle of governance. And that is clearly extending even beyond Florida as it deepens there. And the only political question going forward is, where does that stabilize? And then once it stabilizes, in which direction does it go? Because if I can see a situation, I think that everyone, the hope of everyone from liberals to socialists to communists, is that at some point that process is reversed. That like these states where this happens, there is a sufficient political counter formation to resist it, because the reason it's deepening this quickly is because there's nothing in its place, because there's only the rotten liberal state, and there is no popular resistance to it because we don't have a left in this country. The question is whether one is going to be built up in the process of resisting this thing. And I would say the most likely situation, though, because the left side is so behind the eight ball, is that you see a deepening of floridification across the country until you get not a revolution or a coup or a Trumpian world regime, but a breakup of the United States, not formally perhaps, but a recognition, a de facto recognition of separate legal zones. Yeah. And then you're going to see people with the money moving between them. The final vote is going to be a vote with your feet. And of course, poor people, the poorest people, are not going to be able to move. They're going to be stuck there under some regime of exploitation with some cultural costuming. But you'll just see different regimes of like neoliberal subjugation with a different package of cultural scapegoats to be ritually destroyed, in addition to everybody who's being mulched by the proletarianization and endpoint of profit.
And that's further complicated when you overlay the more near-term effects of climate change, especially down here in Miami.
Right. I mean, that's the funny thing. It's like, what if Florida is like, oh no, DeSantis is going to take over. Hurricane Steve showed up, and it's not a place anymore. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. And again, that's the biggest worry down here in Miami, Tomas, that we always talk about is when that moment comes, when the water comes in and it doesn't go back out. And it's like honestly, people like me, people like you, are going to be able to figure something out, right? We'll be able to make some sort of, claim on our ruined homes and go through the fucking legal process of trying to become whole and, going to Raleigh, North Carolina, or fucking whatever the next shithole is. But millions of people, not just in Miami-Dade, which is like the poorest major metropolitan area in this country, but millions of people around this state are not going to be able to do that. They're not going to be able to vote with their feet. They're not going to be able to do shit about it, and they're going to be at the mercy of FEMA. Good fucking luck. So that's a great note. Can't wait. Yeah, wonderful. Can't wait for that to happen.
Well, I mean, if you're going to have a Florida-based podcast, I think you're going to get used to it.
We talk about it a lot.
You got to get it. Got to.
We hardened our heart.
Got to figure out a way to reverse and end on a high note, because otherwise it's just
Well,
going to be. It's just going to
actually,
be.
Isn't that literally the apocalypse? The end on a high note.
Ending on a high
there you
note.
go.
Yeah.
I can kind of tee us off on a
Leave
high
them
note.
wanting more.
No, I can kind of tee us off on a high note, though, because we actually just interviewed, I don't know if you know her, but a state rep here, Kolanis Kamani. She's pretty progressive.
She's as progressive as you're allowed to be in the state of Florida, without being
but she's just
thrown
good.
in the back of a pickup truck.
Yeah, and she talked about how, Florida does have actually like an anti-elite populist streak to its politics. That's why you can have Donald Trump win the state by 4 points in the 2020 election, as we also approve a ballot initiative to raise the state's minimum wage to $15 an hour with minimal support from the Florida Democratic Party, right? Like that did happen. And, when you look at our history, you look at people like Governor Ruben Askew. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's somebody who, established the state's first corporate income tax, right? And took on a lot of the corporate interest in the 1970s. That corporate income tax has been, gutted since then by, both Democrat and mostly Republican administrations since the late 90s. But do you have like a sense of Florida as an anti-elitist, populist place throughout its history? And, I think it's something that like the Republicans in a lot of way are aware of, whether it's Marco Rubio, like pretending to be like a pro-labor, like anti-Amazon guy, as he has been in the last couple of years, or Ron DeSantis, talking about the Zoom class, the elitist workers who make up the Zoom class. I think they are able to catch on to that in a very performative way without actually delivering the goods for working people. But the Democrats, except for a handful, have not been able to articulate that position as effectively.
Well, they can't at all. I mean, that's the thing that makes, I think, the reason people are so scared is because they cannot see even the shape of a resistance to any of this. I think that belief is even kind of seeping into the hearts of some Democrats, like Biden supporters, which is why I think you're seeing this sort of new moment where everyone's like, maybe it's going okay. Maybe Derek Brandon is rising, because they kind of can't sit too long with the implications of that. So because, things churn, and all of a sudden here's a bunch of stories that your mind can tell you says one thing. Oh, things are going to get better, because it can't handle sticking around with the deeper knowledge that probably not. So you tell yourself a story. Hey, things are getting better. And the thing is, you might be right. There's no way of knowing, because you're just at the mercy. You're floating around on the sea. But things are happening below your line of sight that can't figure into your understanding of things, and that might make the total institutional paralysis of the Democrats not the death knell for resistance, but rather it's birthing pains, because its inability to actually articulate a response creates a vast opening that is going to be filled with something. I mean, that's just a fact of nature. The thing that fills us with dread, but also we need to seriously consider laminating with a little bit of hope is going to come out of that, and we don't know what it's going to be yet.
Yeah, the danger is that we end up with some form of like Strasserist version of American fascism.
Well, the thing is, I don't buy that, because I don't think because there is no left yet to need to be neutralized with that, so it can't arise. It can only rise in response to an actual left movement. And I got to say, if that occurs, I don't think it will actually be effective. I think it will be limited to the strata it currently is, which is people who have scrambled their fucking brains with the internet.
Yeah.
And that is a growing percentage of the U.S. population, which is where the danger comes from. But it is still, thank God, not the majority by any stretch. And there are people out there who are not so poisoned as to not be able to see right in front of their face where their interests lie.
Yeah,
but they have to have a place where those interests are articulated, which does not exist now. We only have the Democrats telling us that it's actually communist Russian disinformation to say that anything's wrong.
Right. Yeah, Tomas, we've seen this though. Like we've seen it. We have an analog that we can look to in like the 70s and 80s and 90s. Like there was, the rest of the country was talking about Cuba, But only down here in Miami were people sending bombs. Only down here were they blowing up magazines. Only down here were people getting gunned down in the streets.
David,
It's kind of like
David, I'll one up you. Xavier Suarez, who was the city of Miami mayor, he's the father of Matt. You might know Francis Suarez, our crypto mayor, who said that
the crypto mayor.
Yeah, we would abolish city taxes because of Miami coin before it lost 99% of its value. Xavier Suarez, his father, when Nelson Mandela got out of jail, Nelson Mandela did a world tour and he made a stop in Miami. Now, the Miami Cubans were very, very angry at Nelson Mandela because Nelson Mandela was, of course, supportive of Fidel Castro. Obviously, the African National Congress was, a socialist organization. Nelson Mandela.
The Cuban Army had more to do with ending apartheid than almost any other organization on earth.
Yeah, Angola, right? Like the liberation of Angola, whatever. So when Nelson Mandela came to Miami, Xavier Suarez, the mayor, not only refused to shake his hand, he led a protest against Nelson Mandela, a world-acclaimed figure. He had just ended apartheid. And, so we are like a global embarrassment.
Yeah.
And we always have been. Like, this city is a global, I call it, I'm sorry, I hate to say it, I call it the toilet of Latin America. It's where like the generals who like fail their coup attempts, the grifters come, it's where you,
those are our other house words. Yeah. Along with, a front to God.
Yeah. And decency.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like a giant Mos Eisley space cantina.
That's a good way of putting it.
I love the fact
a little
that
more humidity.
It's all condos. It's all giant empty condos. And some of them just decide to fall apart now. They put them together with fucking bubble gum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could just be sleeping and then half of your building will just fall over because they put it together with fucking with thumbtacks.
Yeah, the pedestrian bridge that turned out to like caved in and killed like I think 10 people across the street from our biggest university, and turned out that sure enough the Tomas, keep me honest here. It was the county mayor at the time, his brother's construction firm that used all the substandard materials to build it in kind of like overnight, and then shocking when the huge cracks that were presenting weeks ahead of time just ended up crumbling and falling on like 20 cars. That's actually a pretty good, that and Surfside that Matt just alluded to are like, that's the prevailing feeling of how it is to be in Miami. Like anything could fall on you and kill you at any given moment, but like it still kind of just feels good. Like it just feels nice,
That's the thing. It's a pleasant hell. You're like,
pleasant hell.
It's all right. I'll have some ropa vieja. It'll be all right.
Listen to this story. So I used to work construction like 10 years ago, right? And I worked in this one of the Mint building. It's one of these like luxury condos in the Brickell area in downtown Miami. And when I was remodeling an apartment there, and there was drama in the building because they had just approved like the construction of an adjacent building that was going to block the view of the bay for the residents. And the residents were trying to organize the building to go to the city of Miami and like fuck with their zoning approvals. But the problem was that there were not enough residents actually living in the tower, in the condo, because again, like Matt, like you said, like half of these buildings, when you look at them up at night, they're dark, they're unlit because it's a bunch of like Qatari, like Saudi, like Chinese.
It's because suitcases
parking their money in these buildings. They're just buying property.
Exactly. Suitcases full of money don't need light. They don't need any light to see because they're just suitcases filled with cash.
So no one lives there.
Like people point out, a lot of like half-bright conservatives like to point out, the market is an expression of people's real beliefs, and people keep buying all this Miami real estate, which makes me think that they don't actually believe that there's any global warming. It's like, well, they don't have to live there.
Right.
They're not actually there. And they assume, and if you told them, this thing might get like destroyed by a hurricane or something, they'd be like, well, insurance will take care of it. And of course, if everyone claims it at once, the entire system collapses, but they cannot think that way. They can only think about their own narrow short-term interests. They can only conceive of the world in a jump on a lily pad of interested actions.
Yeah.
So that means that the calculus doesn't change no matter how sure you are of climate change and the short time frame that Miami has as a viable fucking urban area.
Yeah, and there's no way to have any of these conversations. Jer, actually, I know you wrote something about.
And also, oh, by the way, I'll probably have sold it by then.
Yeah, you'll flip it by then. Yeah, yeah.
Sure.
Jer, I know that you had written a little bit about this, and maybe you just want to speak to it. What that reminds me of is the conversations. Like, you cannot have a single conversation in Miami or in Florida about the COVID-19 response without being sucked into New York did this, California did that. You think that taking the most basic common sense measures to prevent the maximum amount of death, you think that helps, asshole? Well, why don't you look at New York, because they did something I don't like, or California, they did something, even though the numbers have kind of flipped ever since the proliferation of the vaccine. But Jer, you had written a little bit about that we were going to talk about.
Sure. Do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, if you want.
Sure. So at the end of the last decade, as COVID ravaged through Asia and Europe into the United States, Florida would lead the nation in defeating the virus by pretending it doesn't exist in the hopes it would go away on its own. Mere months into the pandemic, no less than the Disney Corporation would signal Florida's glorious victory of the people over the worst pandemic in a century with a harrowing online video welcoming Americans home to Disney World, which would possibly have been an invitation to permanently destroy your life at Epcot in an even lamer way than is most common. A move to finally put Medicaid expansion on the ballot, which has been, blocked since Governor DeSantis.
Wait, Jer, Matt, yeah. I don't know if you saw those videos when they happened. There was literally it was giving the vibes of like Starship Troopers, little kid. I'm shipping in too. What is it? What is the line in Starship Troopers? Where he's like,
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part. Yeah. It was that, but Disney. Everybody in masks and saying like, we're doing our part. We're partying in Disney, and that's how we're defeating COVID.
I mean, not dissimilar from after 9/11, where it's your duty to go on vacation and go shop at the mall.
Yeah, go to the mall. Don't be scared. Don't be a pussy. Sorry, Jared. Go ahead.
Sure. So a move to finally put Medicaid expansion on the ballot, which it's been blocked ever since Governor DeSantis refused the expansion, starting after the early 2010s, was delayed in 2020 by its organizing committee, and in 2022, a year after the Delta variant slingshotted Florida near the top of the U.S. for rate of COVID deaths, the initiative failed to collect the required number of signatures to even get on the ballot at all. So to your point, Matt, like you said, you can't even see the flicker of a resistance to something as ghastly as being invited into a death carnival, as you said, to do your part for the rest of the world. Anything like a solidaristic taking care of ourselves, taking care of each other, even just making sure that people have basic health coverage, couldn't even get the required signatures to get onto the ballot for a popular referendum in the first place.
Yeah, and it's also what you were talking about earlier, where it's like that's just acquiescing to the point that like, oh, there's this pandemic and we should treat it with some level of seriousness. Forget about like all the virtue signaling and the mask arguments and all that shit. Just like let's all exist in the same reality that this thing is happening. You're making a political statement by doing that. Like you yourself are virtue signaling by acknowledging that this fucking thing even that a pandemic even exists. Just like
and the story keeps changing with them. Like they have a different narrative depending on what's expedient and what's not. But for them to say what we should have just done is nothing. We should have just let it happen and let the worst happen. That is what they accuse the Chinese government of doing between November 2019 into early February 2020. So if it didn't work out over there, why are the laws of physics going to suspend themselves once it reaches the gates of Disney World?
I'm fascinated to have somebody like Matt on, because he's been, now in California. He spent most of the pandemic in New York, and the way that the rest of the country must look at Florida, and the way that we to the extent that they're paying any attention to Florida, the way that we handled the last 2.5 years, it must be just the weirdest thing to try to digest. Like, what the fuck are they doing down there? And I don't have a great answer, honestly.
No, it's America's fetid basement, and there's something growing, there's something fruiting, but we'll see what it is.
President DeSantis.
I think we all best case scenario, got to be honest, for people north of Florida, Georgia line is maybe they're hoping when time comes to it, we can cut it off.
Yeah.
like get gangrenous limb.
You could you could sell it. I mean, that's one thing we've gotten really good at selling.
Now we're talking. What could we sell it to Bukele for fucking crypto bucks?
I mean, you could turn into an archipelago of soccer stadiums and just let anyone who can afford a helicopter be ferried among
the palace. The palace intrigue between Bukele and Francis Suarez would be like too much. Though.
They would be. It would be like the Guelphs and the Ghibellines fighting each other over like this. Yeah, these city states, like in northern Italy. Oh my God, it literally would be that.
Oh yeah,
instead of House of Dragon, House of Crypto.
It would be
the Targaryens and the Valerians,
like the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor in northern Italy. It'll be in the Latin archipelago of casinos and dog tracks and soccer stadiums with helipads connecting them, and then these little petty crypto kings intriguing against one another.
I love the idea of like regional houses of crypto throughout Miami, and just
the House of Ethereum issues the following declaration.
That is the status quo. You don't have to imagine that. That is what we live. Our mayor said that they were going to. He said Miami coin will lead to the abolishment of city taxes. He said, I envision a future where we will no longer need city taxes and revenue to operate city services because of Miami coin. And then he said we were all going to get a Bitcoin dividend, which
guess what, guys? We are abolishing the second law of thermodynamics.
Yeah.
Time travel's possible. This was Tomas, the same time that he said that was when he was also crowing at the top of his lungs about Citadel LLC and Ken Griffin coming down here and saying that like, oh, these are the kind of people that we want coming to Miami. Because if there's anything you know about a guy like Ken Griffin and, hedge fund in general, it's that they improve places where they go. They make the city much better, and they're very
they're giving.
They're eager to pay their share. They
they're
love
altruistic.
It's their favorite thing to do, and it's great that and that was the other sort of funny part of that is how Suarez tried to position a bunch of like grifters in crypto and finance psychopaths and like hedge fund guys as the new tech utopia. Like, oh, Miami's going to become the next Silicon Valley because we're getting this specific flavor of scam artists and hedge fund managers that are going to come down here and bring their workforces and their Lamborghinis.
Yeah. You guys should really do an episode on Miami crypto shit because it's literally just
it does sound fascinating, I have to say.
It's
this
horrific.
idea of like a new medieval guild war is very intriguing.
Yeah, it's the status quo. You don't have to.
We don't have to imagine it's here.
Speculate.
I guess the only question is like, presumably, if DeSantis does try to enforce his will, like Miami would probably end up just becoming like a free city, like at the tip of the peninsula. So then does the rump of Florida, does that have to ally like with some extra state group in order to be sustainable?
What you're touching on is actually an extant condition of Florida conservatism right now. Is that like if you are inside baseball like Tomas, you know that there's about 4 or 5 different striations of like competing conservative, I don't even want to call them ideologies, just like groups, like
it's just a patronage network.
It's just Rick Scott hates Ron DeSantis, and they can't really say why they hate each other. It's not any kind of ideological difference. It's just you had my job.
There's only so much so much money. There's only so much cream. Yep. And they're fighting over the cream because they all have people who depend on them for cream.
Yeah, and Matt Gaetz too, but that's a different kind of cream. Bazing. So look, we've taken up an hour of your time, Matt. We really appreciate you being,
this was lovely. Thanks, you guys.
Helpful by jumping in.
Matt, before we go, what's your expectation for the Florida show, the one and only? We only got you for one.
It's our Halloween show. We're hoping to be in some sort of costume.
Yes.
And we don't know yet. It's all we usually plan right before. We'll probably have some prepared stuff. I know there'll be some film. We have like a new cartoon, and we also have I think we'll have an opening act. I'm not sure if they've been determined yet. And whatever we say will never be recorded. We're not going to release any of these as live episodes. So
Smart
if
move.
you aren't there, you can't hear it.
Okay.
So check it out. ChapoTrapHouse.com is where you can find the tickets, and also they have a lot of merchandise up there, and you can subscribe to the show. And you can follow Matt at Cushbomb on Twitter. Anything else that we should let the fine folks know about, Matt?
That's it. I'm also a Twitch streamer. I'm a sicko.
Oh, that's right.
Kush
the
vlogs,
grill
yeah.
vlog. Yeah.
Yeah.
Listen to that whenever you
So
can.
check that out if you really want to be mentally normal.